Hello, and welcome to the Earthly Roots podcast,
where we chat all things gardening, homesteading, and connecting to nature.
We're your hosts, Diane and Robyn.
The Earthly Roots podcast acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today.
All right, we are finally doing it. We're talking about all things soil health and compost, something that we're both so passionate about and have wanted to chat about for so long. And finally, today's the day.
Yep, we're going to be talking all things compost and, how to do it, what types of compost there are. For beginners as well, we want to make this as simple and as easy to do so that everyone can be composting, because it's a passion of mine, definitely.
Yeah.
I don't think there's no lie about that. I love to talk about it on my YouTube channel and here. I just think it's the most amazing process, and I would love for everyone to start composting, however that may be.
And there are so many different ways to do it. So let's first think about all the misconceptions that you might hear about compost, like the fact that it's really smelly, the fact that it's really difficult to do.
Yeah.
What else?
Well, just that you need a lot of space, that you need a lot of material. It needs to be complicated. You need to have this complicated mix of X percentage of nitrogen, carbon, and all that.
Yep, that you need to always be mixing it and putting in all this hard work to get it going, that it's not supposed to have any bugs in it, or if it does, which kinds are actually supposed to be there.
Yeah.
There's so many things that I think make compost sound really overwhelming to others, that hopefully we can kind of shed light on what we've figured out, on what we've observed, and share some of the things that make composting simple.
Yeah, definitely. So we thought we'd kind of start with chatting about what compost actually is and why you might want to give it a go and try it out. I know a lot of people have probably heard of it. It's something that's spoken about a lot in gardening, and you also buy it as well. You're buying compost a lot of the time. I know it's called compost in a lot of areas of the world where you buy it in bags. Here we kind of say more like potting mix.
Yeah, we do.
When we buy it, but you can buy more like cow manure compost and things like that in places like Bunnings, but you can also just make your own at home using food scraps and food waste and garden waste from your garden.
Yeah, in its simplest form, compost is just matter, some kind of food or plant matter that has broken down to the point where it looks like soil and
Exactly.
acts like it too.
Yeah.
So you can easily add it to your gardens to add a boost of nutrients and then be able to plant into it. And then, as you mentioned, you can add different things into it to amend it to then be suitable to different types of plants. So those that are more nitrogen heavy, those that might like more potassium, more acidic soil, and all the things. So what compromises a healthy compost? What is the bare basic of what it needs to have?
Yeah, so pretty much, well, first of all, you need a lot of life in compost, and that's what we always talk about, life and biodiversity, and having biodiversity in your soil is super important. So that's the first thing that you need to be thinking about when you're making compost, is expecting that it's going to attract life. And there'll be so much going on that you won't be able to see, like bacteria, fungi, nematodes, worms, which you will be able to see. But yeah, just going into it firstly thinking it's going to come alive and be like this living thing that you need to support it. And like plants, like ourselves, like our pets, our animals, we all need food and water and air. So those are the three basics that a compost system also needs.
Yeah. And as far as the food that you would give to it, a lot of you may have already heard other people talking about compost and speaking about adding green material and brown material. And so brown materials can be things like cardboard, coffee grounds, I'm pretty sure, are counted as a green material, even though they're brown. So cardboard, wood chips, straw, bracken, grass clippings that have dried out. So all the green has leached out of them, all the nitrogen has leached out. Anything else I'm forgetting? Brown?
Anything that's dead, pretty much. So yeah, all your brown is your carbon material. So that's like the first big nutrient that it needs for the food, as well as the nitrogen, which we'll get on to. But yeah, for the brown, as Diane was saying, anything that's kind of dead or dying, keeping in mind that it's not going to be pure carbon. You can add kind of pure carbon in if you want to go more like charcoal, adding that in, which we can talk about the benefits of that as well. But yeah, all the plants that you'll be adding in, you just want to make sure that they're predominantly carbon if you're focusing on the carbon. They will have some nitrogen in it, like the grass clippings will still have some nitrogen in there. But that's kind of the first component, is having cardboard. And this makes up like the bulk of your compost.
Yes.
So that's why when you hear people say, oh, make sure you're adding lots of carbon in, that's because that you do need a lot of carbon to make up compost.
Yeah, and you'll know if you don't have enough carbon because it'll smell.
Yeah, exactly.
Like you will smell the decomposition happening and things move, especially if you're not aerating it. But like usually if there's a smell going on and you're worried, a bit of carbon will often fix the problem, and a bit of air.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Yeah, and then the other component is nitrogen as well. So that is all of the green material, all of the living material. So living meaning the plant hasn't completely started the decomposition process into a stick or a dried leaf or something like that.
Yeah.
It's just been picked, or it's all of your food scraps that are still, you know, living and have that nutrients in them, I suppose.
Yep.
Have that water content as well.
Yep.
Yeah.
It is things like manure as well. So animal manure, it can be grass clippings that are green.
Yep.
Fruits, vegetables, leaves.
Yeah. Anything that is basically still living. And I think maybe we could do an Instagram post on just like a long list of carbon and nitrogen examples if you're concerned or worried that you're not, you can't delineate between the two of them. Yeah. So we can do that.
And then there's other things that you can be adding in. You mentioned charcoal before. Wood ash is another thing. You can really be creative with what you add to your soil, to your compost. Grinding up oyster shells or egg shells can go into it as well. Seaweed as well is a great rich source of nitrogen, but also comes with its own minerals and things that you want to be adding in.
Yeah, you can really tailor it to your soil type. So knowing your soil type is really important to know what kind of nutrients and minerals you might be lacking in, and then you can add that, as well as also just like your soil type. So we have really clay soils. So something I want to keep in mind, I probably should do more of, but is add a bit of sand to my compost as well, just to kind of help aerate it a little bit more. Naturally, compost will help to aerate your soils because it's that fluffy organic material, but yeah, sand can also help.
Yeah, and then especially if you know that that's something you want to add into your gardens, you can just do it all in one go.
Yeah, exactly.
As opposed to having to go and do each bit separate.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another thing that some people may not realize but can easily be added to compost is soil. So if you've got pot plants that maybe the plant has died in or is just kind of sitting around, you can put that all onto your compost pile, and that's just going to help the worms and the microbes to move easily through everything else in there.
Yeah, and that would be probably more of a carbon material, depending on what's in the soil already. If it's really dried out, like you've used the soil over and over again in a pot, it might have a bit higher carbon content. Yeah. But it'll definitely help to bring it all together. Yeah. And that's something that with compost you want to be thinking about. With the carbon material, sometimes it's better to have a lot of one carbon material. Like I personally really like sugarcane mulch, which does have a little bit of nitrogen in it, but because it's so fluffy and you get a lot of it and it's really bulky, it mixes in with all of the other food scraps and other nitrogen materials to create a really nice mix. So I prefer to use that. Do you have a...
I do. We live somewhere where we have bracken grow pretty prolifically, and something that we need to do is maintain it and chop it down so that it's not growing faster than everything else around. And I experimented by putting it into the compost pile because it's something that animals can't graze on. It's not good for them because of the rhizomes of it, or I'm not quite sure exactly what's bad for them. But adding that bracken when it's already brown and dry into the compost pile meant that it created like pockets of air just throughout the compost, and this aided in the decomposition so much. It was really fantastic. And we're using something that is otherwise a waste product, or is otherwise something that is causing a lot of harm to our land, really.
Yeah, so I suppose we should also mention, we'll finish off with the two other components, air and water, but we should also mention we will be talking about other types of compost, which won't necessarily need all of these components. But for now, we'll just cover like the basics. Yeah, the basics of like a garden compost pile in like a pile or a tumbler or something like that. We'll also touch on worm farming and bokashi and other types of composting that we also like to do. But yeah, for now, we'll just cover the basics. So you mentioned before air was another thing that you add in, which is definitely something that compost needs.
And it's something that in our systems here, which are a little bit larger, is definitely necessary. So we have a big compost bay that is made from pallets, and we have 2 pallet systems where we put all of our materials into one. It builds up really high. We aerate it with like a garden fork and just kind of like turn it into the other one. So to make the job easier, instead of turning it all in one spot, we're kind of taking it from one place into the other. And so then we're having to do this less often, and over time, just the sheer mass and weight of all the materials will push down the rest and decompose on the bottom.
Yeah, that's good, because then when you're flipping the whole pile, you're making sure that all of the things on the top, which usually wouldn't get decomposed as quick because they're exposed to air and light and everything, on the bottom then. So then all the worms and all the bacteria and things can get at it.
And as things decompose, they naturally become heavier as they become more compact. So then we're putting all that heavy weight on top again, and it's pushing the compost down, giving us more space to add more material on top, and so on and so forth. I know at your home though, you do something a little different. So what's your main compost system?
So for ours we use so we use bins. And I really like these because I can make pretty quick compost, and it's contained in an area. So the ones that we have are tumbleweed compost bins, and they're basically just like a black bin that sits on the ground that doesn't have a base. So it's completely open to the ground so that worms and things can move through the system. And we just pile up our food scraps in that. So it's all contained. It's about kind of, I don't know how tall they are, like half the size of me or so, a bit more than half the size.
About like sitting down.
Yeah. But you can get smaller ones or larger ones. And I usually will do like a layer of our food scraps. Usually we empty our food scraps maybe 2 times a week. We have just a big bin in the kitchen that we use. And then I'll always cover it with sugarcane mulch or some kind of carbon material to just make it easier for me in the long run. And then give it a turn. We've got this little turning material thing. It's like I don't even know what it's called, but it's a compost turner.
We'll make
from
sure
Tumbleweed.
To put a photo of it on our
or I can put a
Instagram.
link in the description as well on YouTube. And it's super easy because it's like a big screw that you screw into the compost bin and then lift it up, and then it just aerates the whole thing.
Easy.
Super easy. It doesn't, like, you don't need a lot of muscles to do it. It's pretty easy. And I like to do that. But the last thing that we should mention to add to compost is water, because water is life. It adds life, and life needs it. So I like to water my compost if I can see that it's dry. I just really keep an eye on it, because all of the nitrogen that I add in has high moisture content anyway. So sometimes you won't need to add water, but for an open pile, I don't know, you might need to
it
add
definitely
a bit more.
dries out, definitely. And especially if you're adding different sources of carbon, you might add something like wood shavings or something that is a lot drier and therefore needs a lot more moisture. And if you're not getting that balance right, especially in such a big system, it is probably vital to add that water. Usually when we're turning the big compost pile, we'll just have a hose going onto it, so we know there's lots of water in there.
Yeah, cool.
So one thing that when I did start my compost pile for the first time, because I had my first experience of the compost pile was this really large system in ground where we were going to have our new garden beds. And one question that I had was, when is my compost ready? And back then I had to do a lot of research because it was also new. And sometimes you can tell pretty easily, like it looks like soil and it's obvious. But other times some things break down less than others, like some things break down faster, some things break down slower. And so your compost can be kind of in a state where it's half finished and half not. Usually the best bet of it being finished is you can't tell what's in it anymore. It all looks the same. But other times you can have situations where you can still see bits of, let's say, like certain types of leaves or the bracken, which was still a little bit within it. And I actually found out that I could take that compost, even though it wasn't completely finished, and I could finish it in my garden bed. So I could spread it out, add some more material on top, and then that finished off the decomposition in my garden beds, and all that nutrients just flowed right into them.
Yeah, that's a great way if you really need to get the nutrients and the materials out from the compost bin and start another one and save a bit of space as well. For me, like I will just like have a look through it and just pick some up and just smell and see whether it like smells earthy or not.
Ooh,
if it smells earthy, you can just put it straight on the ground. It's more you want to worry if like it really smells and you're putting it right onto smaller plants like seedlings. It just could potentially burn them. It might have too of a high nitrogen content, in which case you can add more carbon and then it should be done really quickly. It also could just be anaerobic, meaning it just needs a bit more air. You just want to make sure it just smells like earth. It's not going to smell like that the whole process though. Like it's probably going to stink at some point.
Sometimes.
That's what usually happens, and that's nature. You go to a swamp, it smells. It's just like
especially
what
if it's gotten too much water.
Yeah, so it's really forgiving, I find. Like you can just add a little bit of carbon if you need, more nitrogen if it's too dry and not breaking down. That's something that a lot of people ask is, my compost is not doing anything, like nothing's happening, it's not breaking down. And a way to speed that up is just by adding nitrogen in. You can...
I was going to say turn it.
Or give it a turn.
Move things around.
And add things like grass clippings is probably the best thing to get a compost to kickstart again, or food scraps or anything that has a high nitrogen content. But you can also use things like you can use like sea salt or like fertilizer to kickstart it as well. We're not experts on this, but you can compost your own waste as well. I've never done that. I know a lot of people do it though.
There's definitely systems for it, because as soon as you start bringing manure, whether it's animal manure or human manure, which can have a lot of pathogens depending on what you're eating, you're talking about having a compost pile for a lot longer and putting in a lot more work to aerate it to get rid of all those anaerobic bacteria. Like you don't want it to be still, because as soon as it is, you're not getting the decomposition happening fast enough,
unless you just keep it for a long time. Because another thing we can talk about, there's so many things to talk about with compost, but there's hot and cold composting. So cold composting is leaving it for a lot longer. You generally get more material from cold composting. That's what I usually do. It's a mix between hot and cold, because it does heat up, but not to the temperature that you need for hot composting, as they call it. I can't remember exactly what it is, but it gets to a certain temperature to be able to kill all of the certain types of bacteria and pathogens but it means that with hot composting, you don't get worms a lot of the time.
Oh, okay.
Because it's too hot for them.
Yeah,
They'll
right.
come after the hot composting process, and with cold composting, you get worms all the time, which is why I prefer that method.
Yeah, and you do use a lot more plant-based materials in your compost as well. You don't have, animal manure to add into it. So if you are using animal manure, you do need to have a hot compost at least for part of the time, because otherwise, I mean, you're not going to kill those pathogens. And I honestly feel like the compost will sort itself out eventually anyways, but especially with bigger animals like mammals, like pigs, it's something that is almost necessary. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, we do compost our cat waste, so we can go into that a little bit more, because we don't put that through the same system though. We have a separate system for that. So we can go through that.
So maybe we can talk about why would someone want to start a compost pile, and then after that we'll kind of talk about the different kinds of systems you can have, especially if you're on rural land and you've got a lot of space, whether you're in a suburban space or even an apartment, because there's different methods you can take. Yeah,
there's composting for everyone. So I have a few facts here that I was researching. You can find these facts online. Yeah, they're just these ones here are from the Australian government website. I don't know how they've done their studies. I don't know anything about it, but I'm just going to read a few of the facts just to enlighten you on certain things about food waste, which is the main reason why I compost, is to use food waste and also to have it on the garden, and is probably the main thing that people will be composting in their backyards to start out with. So apparently this is worldwide, this statistic, but 1/3 of the world's food is wasted, which is crazy.
Yeah, can we just sit for a minute and think about that? Like, think of a cup.
Yeah.
1/3 of that is wasted, and then you drink
probably
the rest.
not composted.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's crazy. And globally, 25% of water that's used in agriculture is used to grow food that is ultimately wasted. So it says throwing away one burger wastes the same amount of water as a 90-minute shower.
Wow.
So that's quite a lot of water that we are also wasting. It's not just the food that we waste, it's all of the resources that go into making that food and growing it.
And that's the thing, like we've become, or many people in society, especially living in cities, who are busy working, like they're looking for convenience because they just don't realistically have the time to grow their own food or cook their own food. And they've become so disconnected from what it takes to actually produce the meals in front of you. Yeah, and especially things like grains that you need fields and fields to grow. And I mean, that's just to grow. Think about then having to harvest it, package it, process it. And no wonder water's a part of every step in that process. So yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So whilst, this topic isn't on waste or anything like that, or how to use up all your food, obviously we want to be using as much food as we can from the garden, but it's inevitable that you'll have food scraps and things that you'll just forget about in the fridge that'll go off, and that's okay. But we can create something that's positive out of that through compost. Yeah.
We can close the loop instead of it ending up in landfill and decomposing God knows where, literally in a plastic bag that never breaks down. We can use it in our gardens. And this goes to this is what I love the most about composting, and what got me into it is it saves a lot of money in the long run. Because I'm able to create healthy systems in my gardens to grow my own produce by closing that loop. I'm not having to introduce new material in a lot of the time, because I'm just using what I already have. Especially now at the end of summer, start of autumn time, I'm pulling things out of my garden, things that have finished their life cycle, and I'm throwing it into my compost pile. Yeah,
exactly, which is definitely the same for me as well. There's a few more facts around, we'll keep it to Australia. So apparently we do all food waste specifically costs the economy around $36.6 billion each year.
That's a lot of money.
So that's a lot of money and jobs and resources that is going into dealing with this food waste, which there are a lot of strategies out there that we can, focus on, and minimizing waste is always important. But apparently we waste around 7.6 million tonnes of food across the supply and consumption chain. So this is where we can actually make a difference, this supply and consumption chain, by, selecting things that you'll actually eat.
Yeah. And that's not to say don't experiment with buying something new to eat.
Oh, no.
But it's more so really think about how many meals you can cook with something before it does start to run away, because all food will, and don't buy more than you need. And if you have accidentally bought more than you need, or let's say something's on special and you're going and purchasing that, learn old skills like homesteading, canning, preserving, and make use of those things before they go bad. I know personally one thing that I purchase, especially when it's not summer, is basil, because basil never grows well for me, and I'm always having to buy it. But what happens is I'll use some of the basil, and then unless I do something with the rest of it in the next day or two, it always perishes.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm lucky that I have a compost pile, so I'll just throw it in there. But some of the time I'm a bit worried if I've purchased it from like a supermarket, what things I'm then adding into my compost unintentionally. So I'm always nervous doing that, but it's just getting into the mindset of, all right, I'm only going to use this much basil. The rest of it I'm going to turn into a pesto that I can then have in my fridge for the next few weeks to a month.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's really important, because that also, just then moving on from like the food waste, it reduces the amount that's going into landfill as well, which is a bit different to just wasting food. You're actually taking up valuable resources in landfill if you're just throwing it out.
Yeah.
When it could be going into something like compost or bokashi or whatever system you're working with in your own house, which you shouldn't definitely feel bad about that, because there's there are certain things that go off really quickly, but there's so many things of food that we don't really eat. Like I don't really eat banana peels and things like that, the part of the food. And that is also a major problem, where landfill is it seems pointless to me to add that to landfill when there's so many options around for composting to add it to.
And I actually did want to mention that I said this to you earlier today as well, and I know that it's something that doesn't happen in your shire or your suburbs, but they have put in a new initiative, especially in some suburbs in Victoria, where I've seen them a lot, but I think they're bringing it up around the other states as well. Let us know if you have this around you, but a FOGO bin, or essentially a green bin that then you can also put food scraps into. And I guess this is the government's way of getting the food waste out of the landfill sector, and instead being able to decompose it and process it themselves to then sell as compost. So they have started putting in initiatives and actually taking responsibility for that food waste. And I highly encourage, if you have that system around you and you don't want to compost for yourself, maybe you don't have a garden and you don't have the use for it, at least start to use your green bins. Find out if it's an initiative that is going to start in your area, or if you could petition for it, because I think it's a great way forward.
Yeah, it's definitely such a big resource, like seeing all those facts about all this food that's wasted. It seems so important to tap into that and really focus on that. Firstly, how you can minimize it, but also what to do with this food waste. And we want to make it really realistic for you to not make it as scary or as daunting to compost, because there are, thankfully, these initiatives that are happening, not quite where I'm living, which is super disappointing.
Which is a shame.
It really is. Yeah. I'm really astounded that some councils still don't have proper green waste and are kind of investing in that. I know it will change, and it's also got to be the people in the area wanting that and, saying that it's a problem. But just take it into your own hands for now. If you can't do it, let's compost in a way that works for you. And we can chat through what some of those ways could be and how to do that at home.
Yeah. But the compost you create, if you don't have a garden, you can, like you said, when you compost your cat waste, you're not using that in your garden beds. You're using that more in your landscape gardening or in your native gardens. Did you want to talk some more about that?
I can. Yeah. So it's something that I've like received a lot of like, not backlash, but just like some nasty.
It's brilliant.
It's interesting comments on YouTube of people completely disagreeing about it. So yeah, we have 2 cats and we compost their cat waste. What comes out of the cats, goes, we scoop it out of the kitty litter, which is the kitty litter that we use is also like, it's like recycled paper. I think you've got the same one.
We use that as well.
Yeah, so you can also just chuck that on the garden afterwards. And we have designated worm farms that we put the cat manure into. So it's not a nice job taking it from there to the worm farm, but I guarantee you after that, you do not have to smell it. Like, it doesn't smell. It's not a dirty process. I let the worms do what they need to do, and I'm left with worm castings. So worm farming is a great way to minimize your waste. You can't do as much as you could, with a large compost pile. So there's geese in the background at the moment. You might hear a little bit of farm activity.
That's part of recording the podcast.
It is,
here.
yeah. And yeah, it's a great thing that I've done ever since, like, I was in primary school. We had worm farms. So that's where I started out composting and being able to see this waste being turned into something that's so valuable for the garden. And unlike compost, which can be a little heavy on the nutrients and it can tend to like burn the plants if it is high in nitrogen, with worm castings you can put it straight onto the ground and it won't do that to your plants because it's neutralized. It's a neutral pH, and the worms, the way it goes through their bodies and their little system that they have, it creates such a beautiful neutral material that you can fertilize the garden. But yeah, we do compost the pet waste, and every time I take it out into the worm farm, I'll dig a little hole in the worm farm, cover it back up with sugarcane mulch, and you really can't smell it. That's
brilliant.
Such a cleaner way to do it, in my opinion, rather than putting it in a little bag and then putting it in your rubbish bin. I don't know how many times I had in like the city where we used to live, and people would do this with their pet waste, and their bins would just be filled with maggots. Like, it was the most disgusting thing.
Gross. Or even worse, like with dogs especially, just letting their dogs poo out in the parks or wherever they're visiting and just leaving it there, because at least that way I don't have to package it up and throw it into a bin. So I think it's brilliant what you're doing, and the fact that it's possible to do that is a great thing to share with others. Yeah,
it's definitely, you need to be careful about it, like not, with the worm leachate that you can get from the worm farms, not putting that directly on like lettuce or things that
Something
you would
you're going to eat straight away.
Yeah, I only use the worm castings and put it around native plants down the very back of the property, where I know the water also doesn't leach into my veggie gardens. It's not going to go anywhere really with the amount that I put on the ground, but I just do like to be careful because it probably takes a few months for the worms to do their thing. But still, you could have some kind of bacteria in there that might be unfavorable. Our cats are indoor cats, and this is another thing I'll just quickly wrap up. There's this whole thing about toxoplasmosis or something like that. It's a disease or a virus that cats can get where they eat raw meat, and then that can be really toxic to pregnant people and make you quite sick. Your cats can only get that if they ingest raw meat though. So if your cats are indoors and you're feeding your cats and you know what they're being fed, it's very unlikely you're going to get this disease or virus or whatever it's called. I just wanted to put that out there because everyone tells me so many times, like, you shouldn't do this because you're going to get this. And yeah, unless your cats are always eating raw meat, like from outside, then that's how you could maybe get this. But you just have to be really careful.
But again, you're not putting it onto your vegetable gardens. No. You're not putting it anywhere where you are having those edible plants, because you're just taking those precautions anyways.
Yeah.
So I think worm farms are the best place to start, and I know that's something that we did when we lived in the suburbs as well.
Yep.
So what are like the basics of starting a worm farm? Like what's worth knowing if that's something you want to do, especially if you're in a smaller area like a suburban area, or even on a balcony?
Yeah, well, there's a few different types of worm farms that you can buy. Just go to Bunnings, have a look, or online, wherever you can, or you can just make your own. You can use polystyrene boxes or an old bathtub. There's so many cool ideas on DIYs.
Totes.
Exactly, yeah. But similar to compost, you need food for the worms. You need the worms as well. So there's multiple places online that you can get them.
I think Bunnings does sell
do.
packs of worms.
Yeah. I think that's where I did get mine from. And everyone tells you, like, to start out a worm farm, you need a new pack of worms. But I've just, like, scooped out handfuls of them for all the worm farms, and then they've bred over time. So you need, for worm farms, firstly, you need some kind of bedding for the worms that they will move through, live through, and lay their eggs on to then have more little worm babies throughout the system.
So cardboard, or what would you use for that?
So I use a mixture of cardboard and sugarcane mulch, and any random paper that I have in the house. I try to stick to like more brown paper, nothing with too many dyes in them, because you never know what's in the dyes. That usually just goes into the compost bin.
Toilet paper rolls would be a great option.
Yeah, anything
egg
like
cartons.
that. Egg cartons is a really good one. They really enjoy egg cartons because it's already processed cardboard. Like, it's recycled cardboard, so it's much when it gets wet and decomposes, it's just easier for the worms to move through. So I usually just rip some of that up. So that's kind of your starting bedding that you use, and then you need some kind of like food for them, and you also need some grit. So I usually like to add in like a handful or two of soil, whether it's native soil or just from a bag. That also allows them to move through and live in it, as well as coffee grounds. We always add all our coffee grounds to the worms, and then their food, whether it's from the cats or food waste as well. I don't actually compost a lot of my food waste anymore in these systems because we use the bigger bin now. But when I usually, and one other thing, don't listen to people when they say you can't compost things like oranges and egg shells and things like that. And onion. Yeah. I've tried it out so many times. My worms eat orange peels. They'll eat them. What people are meant to say is, don't just feed them orange peels, or don't just feed them onion peels, because that's obviously not going to be delicious for them. They don't love it as much as they love other things, but adding a little bit here and there, like, don't worry about it. Do not start the whole system again if you add some of that stuff in.
By accident. That's great.
One thing that I don't add anymore, and you can do this, I just don't do the extra step of grinding up the eggshells. I don't add them in as like crushed anymore, or whole eggshells, just because they go in the other compost bin. I just want to save that step of time. But if you are adding them to the worm farm for the grit, which is the grit they need to actually like move the food through the worm's body.
Yeah, similar to a chicken.
Like a chicken.
It's instead of teeth, because they don't have that.
Exactly. Yeah. I'd probably recommend just grinding up all the eggshells in a blender before you add it to the worm farm. So yeah, that's the components that you need. Similar, you need like the carbon material, the nitrogen, and with worm farms you can really get away with a little bit more nitrogen sometimes if you have a really active worm farm. Particularly around summer, they'll be going through a lot of food, so you can add more.
That's great.
And then you basically have different layers that you can alternate and have all the worm castings on one layer, let sit for a while you have the other layer that's active on top. And then you need to water it every now and again just to make sure that you have enough moisture, and then collect that to use on the garden.
Yeah, so and by great. Active you mean that's the area where you're adding the food scraps
exactly to. On the top. Yeah, on the top of the system. So they're really great for small apartments. That's what we had growing up, and everywhere I've lived, pretty much we've had a worm farm. Gets a little tricky in the tropics and the subtropics where we used to live, just because it gets really hot and worms will just die when it's too hot. They'll just be like, nah, can't do this, see you later. Or they'll try and leave the worm farm and find somewhere else to live. And I would always just freeze my food scraps then
For the next
and put
time.
that on the top. Yeah. Or even just in like big ice cream containers, I would just fill the food scraps up, fill it up with water, freeze it. So it was just like a massive ice block, put on top on the really hot, like 40-degree days. And that was fine with like a wet towel over them.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they're like little pets. They're really cute. I love them.
Yeah, but less high maintenance than most other pets.
Yeah.
Do you use the worm castings differently from the liquid that you get from it?
Yeah, usually with the worm castings, if they're not the cat ones, I'll use them in my seed raising mix, because they're so gentle in terms of their pH, and they're high in nutrients. But I think when I mean gentle, I mean like that nutrients is already there, available to the plants in a different way that it is available in compost. And that's why it's so gentle, because it's bioavailable the way the worms process the material. So growing it and having it in a seed raising mix is not going to be as harsh as compost. So I do that, and then sometimes I'll just add it to water and mix it around and make like a compost worm tea that I'll add on. You can also aerate the tea to make a proper compost tea, which I haven't tried yet, but I know a lot of people.
Is that better, is it, to aerate it?
Yeah, so you can, it activates a lot more of the microbes in the soil, and kind of we can go on to like bokashi and that Korean natural farming style, but adding a lot of the live microbes onto the soil. That's where you can get that if you do aerate the water and have like a water pump in there with like a tea bag of worm castings.
How interesting.
Yeah.
So you can
should
really
be cool
get
to
quite
try.
complicated in
You
it.
can
and
go
you can,
crazy levels with the compost.
But it doesn't have to be as well. So hopefully we're kind of showing you that there's, the most basic level, and you're getting really incredible rich compost that you can use on your plants outside. You can use it to improve your plants inside as well. So your pot plants and house plants. And if you are someone that gardens in an apartment or in a smaller space, then a worm tower or a worm farm, can be a really great idea. And another thing is bokashi, which I can never pronounce properly. Bokashi bins, which I don't know a lot about, but I know it's a system where you're adding your food scraps and then covering it up, and you're kind of just continuing to layer it until it processes. Do you know anything more than that?
So it stems from, I think, a lot of Korean natural farming as well, to create live microbes and a fermentation process of the food. It's kind of pretty much like a speed up of breaking the food down before it goes into the compost bin. So you have just these bins, like a plastic tub kind of thing, where you add your food scraps, you tamp it all down, make sure that it's really flat, and there's usually a tap on the bin as well
to get rid of the
liquid.
Bottom. Yeah.
And then you sprinkle on the microbes, which are all activated. Sometimes people use like bran, I think is popular. A lot of different grains you can add in with, you can make your own as well with molasses, and it's kind of like bringing in the natural microbes in the air, kind of like your sourdough, to then create this fermentation process.
Yeah.
And all it's doing is breaking down the food quicker pre-composting. So you can then have a liquid that you can add straight onto your plants, diluted. I've heard you can also use the liquid as a drain cleaner, which is what I'm super interested in, and getting a system to just regularly add the liquid from your bokashi straight into your drains, and it's a natural cleaner. It'll naturally clean the pipes.
Cool.
Yeah.
It's like something you would never think about until someone like just has a go, and it's like, oh, actually this quite works well.
Yeah.
A great resource that I have as far as composting goes is on Instagram, you can find her Compostable Kate.
Yeah.
She lives in this area that we're in here, and she's a wealth of knowledge. Like, she has great compost piles. She has all this knowledge and, like, all the scientific background in it. So I highly recommend just going and checking her out. But yeah, Bokashi bins are a really great idea because they are so small and slim, and it's something you can just keep underneath your sink and just be filling it up and then bringing it out into your garden. And another really easy method for composting, if you don't have a lot of space but you do have garden beds, is literally just dig a trench in your garden or in soil outside near your plants and bury your food scraps in there. It can be as simple as that.
Yeah, that's my favorite one.
Isn't it
brilliant? One of my
brilliant?
favorites. I used to do this all the time, and I even did it in like this tiny little townhouse that we lived in, our little courtyard, which is so small, and I had all this food waste, and I was like, I'm not throwing this out. So I just started digging little holes around, and I also just had like buckets that I would have food waste and weeds and everything, and I would just keep it in that. It would go rancid, like so smelly.
But a great way to get rid of weeds.
It was, a good way. I probably left it in there way too long, but then I would just bury the whole thing. It got to a point where it's just getting a bit much, so like I didn't have enough room in the courtyard to keep burying things. So sorry to the next people coming in if they were doing some excavating in the area. It was getting so bad that like it was literally, when I would open the bucket, flies from the neighborhood would just like be attracted to it. It was so disgusting. But it was my first like intro to really understanding all of compost and what I can do with it. But yeah, burying compost, or not burying compost, just burying like food scraps is really great.
It's just simple.
It definitely works. Yeah, it works so well to just encourage worms to your gardens, like not burying them like directly under a tomato or whatever. You could just bury it like next to it. If you're really ready to plant in it, because you don't want to be planting a tomato right into food scraps some of the time. Yeah,
really know where you're planting it, of course. And another one that goes really easily with that, and I mentioned earlier, is creating something like a worm tower. And I mean, I haven't really researched much about it. This was just something that I was like, well, you have a worm bin. Why not create that same kind of concept in your garden with a pipe? And so I took a pipe, I drilled some holes into it, and I put it into my garden, and then I started filling it from the top with food waste or garden waste, filling it up on top, covering it up so that the rain doesn't get in. And what I noticed over time is worms coming in and eating away at that food and then being able to add more on top. And because it's in your garden bed, all that nutrients is just coming right back in.
Yeah,
I love that.
No, I would really like to try one of those. It looks really great.
Yeah, and it's simple. I love simple composting. It doesn't have to be hard.
No. And also, if you can't do any of this in your garden, if you're living in a place with no balcony or nowhere to do this, just looking up your community gardens, I can guarantee you there's someone who will want your food waste. I can't remember. I think it's called, let me just quickly Google this. I'm pretty sure it's called share waste.
While you're doing that, feeding it to animals can be a good idea as well. So when we had pigs, we went down to our local farmers market and we asked them if any of their food waste, not our farmers market, our whole food bulk place, and they had food scraps that they were composting in the back of their shop, but they were happy to offload it to us to feed to our pigs. So 100% there'll be someone in your community that is wanting your food scraps.
Yeah, and it is called Share Waste, the app. So you can actually register on there, and you can register for someone who has food scraps who wants to give them out, or you can register as someone who can take your food scraps. So you can register also if you have chickens or if you just have a compost pile, so that people in your neighborhood, they won't know your like exact address until you obviously chat to them. But you can just send them a message and say, hey, I just saw you pop up in my area. I've got all this food scraps, but I can't do anything about it. Do your chickens want them, or do you want them for your compost pile? And I'm sure there's some other apps out there or Facebook pages as well that you can find. Someone will definitely want them.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So maybe by the end of this episode, as you guys are listening to it, or we're going to leave it down in the description box as well, look up share waste, get in contact with someone, or don't get in contact with someone. I just mean like sign yourself up so that the next time you need food scraps or you have some to give to someone else, share the word and someone will benefit from it.
Yeah. We'll definitely take your food scraps if you're in this area.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
We have plenty of compost piles to put them into.
Exactly. Yeah. So hopefully we kind of did a broad intro to composting, what it is, different ways you can compost. There's so many other different ways as well that we didn't really go into. But this was the main ones.
Yep.
That
Compost part 2. We'll do one in the future,
Yeah.
I'm sure.
Yeah, maybe if you have any specific questions for composting, we could answer, because I know it is really dependent on your own climate, and your own compost pile is going to be completely different. But I think there's a lot of frequently asked questions that we could go through and chat through. Just how to fix a compost pile, or how to really start it from scratch, and we can go through all the details.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think we covered everything we wanted to, because we've been thinking about it for a long time, about this beautiful topic of compost.
I agree. Hopefully we took away some of the doubt or some of the fear that you may have had with composting, or just allowed you to explore some different alternatives if the system you do have isn't working or needs an upgrade as well. I think we'll have a post on our Instagram page when this podcast comes out, so that if you have any more questions about composting and you'd like us to do a bit of a part 2 answering those questions, or trying to investigate some of the answers for you so that you don't have to do all the work, we would love to do that. So go and check that out.
Yeah, that sounds good. And we'll try and post some photos of our compost setups that we have in our garden as well, so you can have a look and see what system might work for you. And I definitely want to try bokashi composting, so I'll let you know how it goes. I really want to try it.
And I'd love to bring in some more worms around here, like a worm farm or something, so that's going to be a cool little experiment too.
Yeah.
So as always, thank you for joining us. Head over to Buy Me a Coffee if you would like to support us any further. Leave the video a like, because it just shares it out to other people as well.
Yeah, definitely. It keeps us motivated as well to see your comments and your feedback. And you can always review the podcast on any podcasting app that you listen to or prefer, or rate the podcast as well. Yeah, we'd love to hear from you and your feedback. Yeah.
Well, we'll see you guys on the next podcast episode. Can't wait.
Thanks for listening/watching. Bye.
Bye.